A day that changed everything. Clara Henderson was a woman of unwavering resolve. At 73, she had lived a life filled with challenges, victories, and an unyielding commitment to fairness. Despite her age, Clara carried herself with the kind of grace and confidence that turned heads, though she never sought attention. On what seemed like an ordinary morning, she arrived at the bustling airport, eager for a journey that would mark a milestone in her life. She had just celebrated the 50th anniversary of her first company, a small community grocery store that she had transformed into a nationwide chain. This trip, a celebratory getaway, was a testament to her relentless perseverance. Clara's flight was scheduled for late afternoon, but she always liked to arrive early. Airports fascinated her. The mix of travelers, each carrying their own story, and the occasional snippets of joy or tension that echoed across the terminals. She pulled her modest yet sturdy suitcase toward the first-class check-in desk, savoring the thought of a comfortable journey ahead. Clara had long been a first-class traveler, not because she flaunted her wealth, but because it represented the fruits of her labor. It was her quiet celebration of everything she had worked so hard to achieve. She handed her ticket and ID to the young attendant behind the counter. He was in his late 20s, with neatly combed hair and a meticulously pressed uniform. Yet his eyes betrayed an indifference that Clara immediately noticed. "Good afternoon," she greeted him warmly, her smile gentle and inviting. The attendant glanced at her papers and then at Clara herself. His brow furrowed slightly as if her presence in the first-class line disrupted some unspoken order. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am, this line is for first-class passengers," he said curtly, pointing toward the economy check-in desk on the far end of the terminal. Clara blinked, momentarily taken aback. "I am a first-class passenger," she replied, her tone calm but firm. She held out her ticket again, certain the mistake was a simple misunderstanding. The attendant barely glanced at it before shaking his head. "This can't be right," he muttered under his breath. Then, louder, "Please step aside so I can assist the next customer." For a moment, Clara felt the kind of disbelief that rendered her motionless. It wasn't the first time she'd faced bias. Her journey as a woman of color in the business world had been fraught with challenges. But this was different. The dismissive tone, the assumption that she didn't belong, it wasn't just hurtful, it was infuriating. "I assure you, there's no mistake," Clara insisted, her voice growing firmer. "I booked this ticket weeks ago." The attendant's demeanor shifted from dismissive to openly hostile. He crossed his arms and raised his voice, drawing the attention of nearby travelers. "Ma'am, I don't know how you got this ticket, but first class is reserved for those who actually paid for it. Now, if you don't move, I'll have to call security." A murmur rippled through the surrounding crowd. Clara's cheeks burned, not with embarrassment, but with anger. She had spent decades proving herself in a world that often refused to see her worth. She had built her businesses, supported her community, and broken barriers. And now, here she was, being publicly humiliated by someone who saw her as unworthy based on nothing more than her appearance. "Call them," Clara said quietly, her eyes locking onto the attendants. Her tone wasn't confrontational. It was calm, steady, and filled with a resolve that made the young man falter for a moment. Before he could respond, another airline employee, a middle-aged woman with a professional yet empathetic air, stepped forward. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, looking between Clara and the attendant. "This woman is trying to board first class, but clearly she doesn't belong here," the attendant replied, his voice laced with irritation. The woman turned to Clara, her expression softening as she took in the older woman's composed demeanor and the ticket still clutched in her hand. "May I see your boarding pass, ma'am?" Clara handed it to her without hesitation. The woman's eyes scanned the ticket, and her face immediately tightened with disapproval, not at Clara, but at her colleague. "This ticket is valid," she said firmly, turning to the attendant. "Please escort Mrs. Henderson to the first-class lounge." The attendant's face reddened, but before he could protest, Clara held up a hand. "That won't be necessary," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "I'll find my own way." Clara walked away, her head held high, but the sting of the encounter lingered. As she made her way to the lounge, she replayed the incident in her mind. It wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been made to feel invisible, unwelcome, or unworthy. In the quiet of the lounge, as she sipped a cup of tea, an idea began to take shape. Clara had spent her life fighting for justice and equality, not through grand speeches or protests, but through action. She had built businesses that empowered her community, mentored young entrepreneurs, and donated generously to causes she believed in. This was no different. By the time her flight was called, Clara had made a decision. This wasn't just a personal insult, it was an opportunity to create change. As she settled into her first-class seat, she opened her notebook and began to write. The airline may have tried to diminish her, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Clara Henderson wasn't just a passenger. She was a force to be reckoned with. The flight attendants avoided her gaze, likely aware of the incident at the gate, but Clara didn't mind. She was too busy outlining her next steps. This wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. And Clara Henderson knew exactly how to earn it. The journey ahead wasn't just about reaching her destination. It was about taking a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And as the plane soared into the sky, so did Clara's resolve. The airline had underestimated her. They wouldn't make that mistake again. Planting the seeds of change. Clara Henderson didn't sleep much the night after her flight. She had arrived at her destination, a serene coastal city where she planned to unwind. But her mind was ablaze with thoughts. The humiliation she endured at the airport had left a bitter taste, but it had also lit a fire within her. Clara wasn't someone who backed down, and she certainly wasn't someone who allowed injustice to go unchecked. In her hotel room, overlooking the endless blue expanse of the ocean, Clara began researching the airline's history, its policies, and most importantly, its leadership structure. She wanted to know everything about the company that had treated her as an afterthought. By sunrise, she had pages of notes and a clear plan forming in her mind. Clara's success in life wasn't just due to hard work. It was her ability to think strategically and act decisively. This situation, she realized, wasn't just about a rude gate attendant or a single humiliating encounter. It was about systemic issues, bias, arrogance, and a lack of accountability that allowed such behavior to thrive. She picked up her phone and made a call to her longtime friend and attorney, Gregory Young. Gregory had been her confidant and legal advisor for over 2 decades, and he knew Clara well enough to recognize that when she called him early in the morning, it wasn't for idle chat. "Clara," Gregory greeted, his voice warm but curious. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this early morning call?" "I need your expertise, Gregory," Clara said, skipping pleasantries. "I want to buy an airline." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, Gregory chuckled. "You're not serious, are you?" "Oh, I'm very serious," Clara replied. "And I need you to help me make it happen." Gregory's tone shifted, the laughter replaced by curiosity. "What happened, Clara?" "Buying an airline isn't something you just wake up and decide to do." Clara recounted the events at the airport, her voice steady, but tinged with indignation. She explained how the attendant's dismissal wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been judged unfairly. By the time she finished, Gregory was silent for a moment. "That's unacceptable," he finally said, his voice firm. "But Clara, buying an airline is no small feat. It's not just about money. You'd need to deal with shareholders, regulations, and more. Are you sure about this?" "I've never been more certain of anything," Clara replied. "This isn't just about me, Gregory. It's about creating a legacy. I've spent my life fighting for respect and equality, and I won't let this stand." Gregory sighed, though Clara could hear the hint of admiration in his voice. "All right. If anyone can pull this off, it's you. Let me make a few calls, and see what we're dealing with." Over the next few days, Clara and Gregory worked tirelessly. Gregory reached out to his network, gathering information about the airline's financial health and ownership structure. Clara, meanwhile, mobilized her resources. She contacted old business partners, arranged meetings with investors, and even reached out to organizations that advocated for diversity and inclusion in the workplace. But Clara knew that acquiring an airline wasn't just about money or connections. It was about strategy. She needed to approach this with the same precision and determination that had built her empire. Clara's first move was to gather allies. She contacted influential figures in her network, people who had experienced discrimination in one form or another and who shared her vision for change. One of them was Angela Torres, a former flight attendant who had left the airline industry after facing years of bias and harassment. Angela was now a prominent advocate for workers' rights, and Clara knew she would be a valuable partner. When Clara explained her plan, Angela didn't hesitate. "Count me in," she said. "I've been waiting for someone to take a stand like this." With Angela's help, Clara began reaching out to current and former employees of the airline. She wanted to hear their stories, the good, the bad, and the ugly. What she learned only strengthened her resolve. There were stories of flight attendants who had been penalized for speaking out against unfair practices, pilots who had been passed over for promotions due to their race or gender, and customers who had been treated with the same dismissiveness Clara had experienced. One story, in particular, stood out. A young woman named Rachel, who had worked as a gate agent for the airline, shared her experience of being reprimanded for assisting a disabled passenger beyond what was deemed necessary. "They said I was slowing down the boarding process," Rachel recalled, her voice trembling with emotion. "But that passenger needed help, and I wasn't going to ignore that." Clara listened intently, her heart heavy, but her determination unwavering. "Rachel," she said gently, "what you did was the right thing. And I promise you, things are going to change." Clara's next step was to make her intentions known. She scheduled a meeting with the airline's CEO, a man named Richard Calloway, who was known for his no-nonsense approach to business. Clara had met many men like Richard in her career, confident, sharp, and often blind to the realities faced by people outside their privileged bubble. The meeting took place in the airline's sleek, glass-walled headquarters. Clara, dressed in a tailored suit that radiated authority, walked into the building with her head held high. She wasn't there to plead or complain. She was there to negotiate. Richard greeted her with a polite but distant smile. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I understand you've had some concerns about our service." Clara shook his hand, her grip firm. "I do," she replied. "But I'm not here to discuss service. I'm here to discuss ownership." Richard's smile faltered. "Ownership. That's right," Clara said, her tone steady. "I'm interested in acquiring your airline, and I'm prepared to make a very competitive offer." For a moment, Richard looked stunned. Then he chuckled, though there was an edge of discomfort in his laughter. "Mrs. Henderson, with all due respect, running an airline is a complex business. Are you sure this is something you want to pursue?" Clara's gaze didn't waver. "Mr. Calloway, I've built an empire from the ground up. I've faced challenges that would make most people crumble. This isn't about what I want. It's about what needs to be done. Your airline has a culture problem, and I intend to fix it." Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "This is highly unusual," he said, "but I'll hear you out." Clara outlined her vision with precision and passion. She spoke about creating a culture of respect, implementing comprehensive diversity training, and establishing policies that prioritized customer and employee dignity. By the time she finished, Richard looked more intrigued than dismissive. "I'll need time to consider your proposal," he said finally. "Take all the time you need," Clara replied, standing to leave. "But know this, I'm not backing down. This is only the beginning." As Clara walked out of the office, she felt a sense of clarity and purpose she hadn't felt in years. The journey ahead would be difficult, but she was ready. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. And Clara Henderson was just getting started. A storm of resistance. Clara Henderson's bold move to acquire the airline had set off ripples across the industry. News of her meeting with CEO Richard Callaway had leaked to the media, sparking headlines and debates. Articles painted her as either a visionary reformer or a wealthy troublemaker seeking attention. Clara paid no mind to the noise. She had a plan, and nothing would deter her. But not everyone was on board. Behind the scenes, Richard Callaway was rallying his allies. The airline's board of directors was a tightly knit group of seasoned executives who saw Clara's move as a direct threat to their power. They had built their careers on maintaining the status quo, and the thought of an outsider, especially a 73-year-old black woman, challenging their authority was unacceptable. "She's overstepping," one board member said during a private meeting. "We can't let someone like her waltz in and take over." Richard nodded, though he was less dismissive than his colleagues. Clara had impressed him during their meeting, but his loyalty was to the board. "We'll need to tread carefully," he said. "She's resourceful, and she has the media's attention. We can't afford to underestimate her." Their strategy was clear: stall Clara's efforts while quietly discrediting her. They leaked rumors to the press, suggesting that her attempts to buy the airline were a publicity stunt. They reached out to her business associates, hinting that her financial stability was in question. And they doubled down on their internal policies, enforcing a facade of professionalism and inclusivity to counter her accusations. Clara was aware of these tactics. She had faced resistance her entire life, and this was no different. She had anticipated pushback and was ready to meet it head-on. Clara's first public move was to hold a press conference. The event was held in a modest community center, not a grand hotel ballroom. Clara wanted to emphasize that her fight was for everyday people, not corporate elites. The room was packed with reporters, community leaders, and supporters, all eager to hear her message. Clara stepped onto the small stage, her presence commanding despite her petite frame. She wore a simple navy suit, her silver hair neatly styled. As the cameras flashed, she smiled warmly, then began to speak. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady. "Thank you all for being here today. I stand before you not as a businesswoman or a philanthropist, but as someone who has experienced firsthand the pain of disrespect and exclusion." She recounted her experience at the airport, not with anger but with a quiet intensity that resonated with the audience. She spoke about the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to persist and her vision for an airline that valued every passenger and employee. "This is not just about me," Clara continued. "It's about creating a world where dignity and respect are not privileges but rights, and I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to make that vision a reality." Her words were met with applause and a flurry of questions from reporters. Clara answered them thoughtfully, refusing to be baited by attempts to sensationalize her story. She remained calm, poised, and unwavering in her resolve. The press conference was a turning point. Clara's story gained widespread attention, with news outlets and social media platforms buzzing about her bold stand. Support poured in from unexpected places: civil rights organizations, labor unions, and even a few celebrities who admired her courage. But the increased visibility also brought challenges. Clara began receiving hate mail and threats from anonymous sources. Online trolls attacked her age, appearance, and motives, questioning why she couldn't just let it go. Clara didn't let the negativity faze her. She had faced worse in her life and emerged stronger each time. Instead, she focused on building her coalition. Angela Torres proved to be an invaluable ally. Together, she and Clara organized a series of town hall meetings in cities where the airline had major operations. These meetings were open to the public, and Clara used them as a platform to gather stories from passengers and employees alike. At one such meeting in Atlanta, a young father named Marcus stood up to share his experience. He had been traveling with his 2-year-old daughter when a flight attendant rudely told him to quiet the child, threatening to remove them from the plane. "I felt helpless," Marcus said. his voice breaking. "I was just trying to get my daughter home to see her grandmother. We weren't being disruptive, but they treated us like we didn't belong." Clara listened intently, her expression one of empathy and determination. "Marcus, I'm sorry that happened to you," she said. "Your story, and others like it, are why this fight matters. No one deserves to be treated that way." These meetings not only provided Clara with valuable insight, but also galvanized support. People began sharing their own stories on social media, using hashtags like #RespectInThiskies and #FlyWithDignity. The movement was gaining momentum, and Clara's name became synonymous with justice and reform. Behind the scenes, Clara and Gregory were making progress on the acquisition. They had identified key shareholders who might be open to selling their stakes in the airline. Clara personally reached out to several of them, not with flashy promises, but with genuine conversations about her vision for the company. One such meeting was with Evelyn Carter, an elderly woman who owned a significant portion of the airline stock. Evelyn had inherited the shares from her late husband and was known for her no-nonsense attitude. Clara met Evelyn at her sprawling estate, where they shared tea in a sunlit garden. "Mrs. Carter," Clara began, "I know you've heard about my efforts to acquire the airline. I want to assure you, this isn't about revenge or ego. It's about creating something better, something we can both be proud of." Evelyn studied Clara for a long moment, then smiled. "You remind me of myself," she said, determined, passionate, and not afraid to ruffle a few feathers. "I've been holding on to these shares out of loyalty to my husband's memory, but I think he would have admired what you're trying to do. Let's talk numbers." By the end of the meeting, Evelyn had agreed to sell her shares to Clara, marking the significant victory in the battle for control of the airline. But as Clara gained ground, the resistance intensified. The airline's board of directors launched a smear campaign, painting Clara as an opportunist who was out of her depth. They accused her of trying to disrupt the industry for personal gain, using carefully crafted statements to undermine her credibility. Clara responded with grace and transparency. She held another press conference where she addressed the accusations head-on. "I understand that change is uncomfortable," she said, "but discomfort is the price we pay for progress. I'm not here to disrupt. I'm here to rebuild, and no amount of resistance will deter me from that goal." Her words struck a chord, and public support for Clara continued to grow. People saw through the board's tactics and rallied behind her. As the storm of resistance raged on, Clara remained steadfast. She had weathered many battles in her life, and she knew that the fiercest opposition often came just before the breakthrough. Clara Henderson wasn't just fighting for an airline. She was fighting for respect, equality, and a legacy that would outlast her. And she was prepared to do whatever it took to win. Turning the tables. As Clara Henderson continued her battle to acquire the airline, the tides began to shift. Public support for her cause had grown into a full-blown movement, with thousands of people rallying behind her message of respect and equality. Social media was flooded with hashtags like #FlyWithDignity and #ClaraTakisFlight, and her town hall meetings were becoming standing-room-only events. Despite the smear campaign launched by the airline's board, Clara's authenticity and resilience resonated with people from all walks of life. Clara knew, however, that public opinion alone wouldn't win the fight. She needed to make a bold, strategic move to break through the resistance she was facing from the airline's leadership. The shareholders' meeting. Clara's first major opportunity came when the airline announced an upcoming shareholders' meeting. Traditionally a closed-door affair, this meeting was where the board of directors presented their plans and financial reports to shareholders. Clara wasn't just attending. She was preparing to make her presence impossible to ignore. In the weeks leading up to the meeting, Clara and Gregory Young worked tirelessly to secure more shares. Clara had already purchased Evelyn Carter's stake, which gave her significant leverage, but she wasn't stopping there. She used her vast network of business contacts and community leaders to rally support, convincing them to either sell her their shares or vote in her favor. By the day of the meeting, Clara had amassed a substantial percentage of the airline stock, enough to ensure that her voice would carry weight in the boardroom. The shareholders' meeting was held in a luxurious hotel ballroom, filled with wealthy investors, corporate executives, and media representatives. Clara arrived early. Dressed in a simple yet elegant black suit, she wasn't there to impress. She was there to command respect. As she entered the room, conversations hushed, and heads turned. Clara's presence was magnetic, and even those who had dismissed her as a nuisance couldn't ignore her now. She greeted those around her politely, but with an air of quiet confidence that made it clear she wasn't there to play games. The meeting began with the usual formalities: financial reports, updates on company initiatives, and a carefully rehearsed presentation by the CEO, Richard Calloway. The board seemed determined to project an image of stability and progress, glossing over the public controversies that had erupted in recent weeks. When the floor was open for shareholder comments, Clara seized her moment. She rose from her seat and approached the microphone, her every step deliberate. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady and clear. "My name is Clara Henderson, and I am both a shareholder and a customer of this airline. I am here today to address not just this board but everyone in this room who believes that business as usual is good enough." The room fell silent as Clara spoke. She recounted her experience at the airport, framing it not as an isolated incident, but as a symptom of a deeper cultural issue within the airline. She shared stories from the town hall meetings, highlighting the voices of employees and passengers who had been marginalized and mistreated. "This isn't just about customer service," Clara said, her voice rising with conviction. "This is about respect. This is about creating a company culture that values every individual, regardless of their age, race, gender, or background. And as a shareholder, I believe it is our responsibility to demand better." Her words were met with a mix of reactions. Some in the audience nodded in agreement, while others whispered among themselves, clearly uncomfortable. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that Clara wasn't just a vocal critic, she was a force to be reckoned with. The board's counterattack. Richard Calloway was the first to respond. Rising from his seat, he addressed Clara with a composed but measured tone. "Mrs. Henderson, we appreciate your passion and your commitment to fairness," he began. "But running an airline is a complex business. We have policies and procedures in place for a reason, and while we are always open to feedback, change cannot happen overnight." Clara met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Mr. Calloway," she replied. "But it doesn't happen at all if we refuse to acknowledge the problem." The tension in the room was palpable. Clara's words had struck a nerve, and the board knew it. One board member, an older man with a gruff demeanor, attempted to dismiss her concerns entirely. "With all due respect, Mrs. Henderson, your anecdotal experience doesn't reflect the overall performance of this airline. We are a business, not a social experiment." Clara didn't flinch, and with all due respect, she countered, "Your business is failing if it cannot treat its customers and employees with basic human decency. Ignoring these issues won't make them go away. It will only drive people like me to demand accountability." Her words were met with a smattering of applause from some of the shareholders in the room. The turning point. The board's attempts to undermine Clara only strengthened her resolve. She had prepared for this moment, and she wasn't about to back down. Clara presented a proposal, a comprehensive plan to reform the airline's culture and operations. Her plan included mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, an overhaul of the company's customer service policies, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to address complaints of discrimination and bias. She concluded her presentation with a powerful statement. "This airline has the potential to be a leader in its industry, not just in profits, but in principles. But that will only happen if we are willing to confront the uncomfortable truths and take bold action. I'm here to help make that happen." The room erupted into a heated debate. Some shareholders supported Clara's proposal, recognizing the potential benefits of her vision. Others resisted, clinging to the status quo and questioning whether such changes were necessary or feasible. Richard Calloway, visibly torn, called for a brief recess to consult with the board. A strategic victory. During the recess, Clara didn't sit idly. She moved through the room, engaging with shareholders and answering their questions. Her charisma and sincerity won over several undecided investors, many of whom were impressed by her commitment and vision. When the meeting reconvened, the board announced their decision. While they didn't fully endorse Clara's proposal, they agreed to form a committee to explore the feasibility of implementing her recommendations. It wasn't the outright victory Clara had hoped for, but it was a significant step forward, a crack in the armor of the status quo. As the meeting adjourned, Richard Calloway approached Clara. "You've made quite an impact today," he admitted. "I underestimated you." Clara smiled faintly. "You're not the first," she replied. The aftermath. News of the shareholders' meeting spread quickly, further elevating Clara's profile. Her speech was hailed as a rallying cry for change, and her proposal became a blueprint for what a modern, inclusive airline could look like. But Clara knew the battle was far from over. The board's decision to form a committee was a tactical move to buy time and placate the public. If she wanted to see real change, she would need to keep pushing, harder than ever before. As Clara left the hotel, surrounded by supporters and reporters, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The resistance she faced only fueled her determination. She wasn't just fighting for an airline. She was fighting for a legacy of dignity and respect. And Clara Henderson wasn't finished yet. Behind enemy lines, Clara Henderson was not the type to celebrate small victories for long. The cracks she had made in the airline's corporate facade during the shareholders' meeting were a start, but she knew the real battle was only beginning. The board's decision to form a committee felt more like a stalling tactic than a genuine step toward change. Clara had seen such maneuvers before in her decades of business experience, and she wasn't about to let her momentum slip away. In the weeks following the meeting, Clara doubled down on her efforts. The committee, tasked with exploring her proposed reforms, moved at a glacial pace, as she had expected. The board, led by CEO Richard Calloway, seemed content to drag their feet, likely hoping the public interest in her campaign would fade. Clara, however, had no intention of letting that happen. Unearthing the truth, Clara and her growing team of supporters began digging deeper into the airline's operations. Angela Torres, Clara's trusted ally and a former flight attendant, led a grassroots effort to collect first-hand accounts from current and former employees. What they uncovered painted a troubling picture. "There's a culture of fear," Angela reported during one of their strategy meetings. "Employees are afraid to speak up about discrimination or mistreatment because they know there will be retaliation. Promotions are often based on favoritism rather than merit, and customer complaints are swept under the rug." Clara listened intently, her expression grim. She knew these issues weren't unique to the airline industry, but the scale of the problem was staggering. "We need proof," she said. "Documentation, testimonies, something that will force their hand." Angela nodded. "I've already started reaching out to people who are willing to share their stories publicly. It's risky, but some of them are fed up enough to take the chance." At the same time, Clara's attorney, Gregory Young, was working on the legal front. He filed a series of Freedom of Information Act requests to obtain records of customer complaints and internal memos related to discrimination claims. The results were damning. One memo, in particular, stood out. It was an email exchange between two executives discussing how to minimize the visibility of a high-profile customer's complaint about racial bias. "This is gold," Gregory said, sliding the printout across the table to Clara. "It shows a clear pattern of negligence, if not outright complicity." Clara studied the document, her jaw tightening. They're not just ignoring the problem. They're actively covering it up. This is exactly what we need to expose. Turning public opinion. Armed with evidence, Clara launched a coordinated media campaign. She partnered with civil rights organizations and labor unions to amplify the voices of employees and customers who had been wronged. Stories of bias, mistreatment, and negligence flooded the airwaves and social media, painting a vivid picture of an airline desperately in need of reform. Clara's efforts attracted the attention of influential figures, including lawmakers and activists who saw her campaign as a rallying point for broader systemic change. She was invited to speak at conferences, town halls, and even a congressional hearing on corporate accountability. During one such event, Clara delivered a powerful speech that left the audience in stunned silence. "This isn't just about an airline," she said, her voice steady but impassioned. "It's about the values we hold as a society. Are we willing to accept mediocrity and injustice, or are we going to demand better? For too long, companies have prioritized profits over people. That ends now." Her words were met with thunderous applause, and the video of her speech quickly went viral. The movement she had sparked was no longer just about her. It had become a nationwide call to action. Inside the boardroom, while Clara was making waves in the public sphere, the airline's board was scrambling to contain the fallout. CEO Richard Calloway called an emergency meeting to address the growing crisis. "We're losing control of the narrative," one board member said, his voice tinged with panic. "Every day, more people are sharing their horror stories. Our reputation is in free fall." Richard remained calm, though his furrowed brow betrayed his concern. "We need to act decisively," he said. "Clara Henderson is a formidable opponent, and ignoring her isn't an option. But we can't give in to all her demands. It would set a dangerous precedent." Another board member chimed in. "What about a compromise? We could implement some minor reforms to placate the public while keeping the core of our operations intact." Richard nodded slowly. "It's worth considering. But whatever we do, it needs to be enough to buy us time." Unbeknownst to the board, Clara had already anticipated their next move. She had a source inside the company, a mid-level manager who had grown disillusioned with the airline's practices. This source provided Clara with valuable insights into the board's deliberations, giving her a crucial advantage. "They're planning to offer a token gesture," the source told Clara during a clandestine meeting. "A few policy changes, nothing substantial. They think it will be enough to quiet the backlash." Clara's lips curved into a determined smile. "Then we'll make sure it's not enough. If they want to play games, we'll make the stakes higher." The final push. Clara's next move was bold and unprecedented. She organized a nationwide boycott of the airline, calling on customers to take a stand against discrimination and mistreatment. The boycott was backed by unions, advocacy groups, and even some high-profile celebrities who lent their voices to the cause. The impact was immediate and devastating. Ticket sales plummeted, and the airline's stock price took a nosedive. News outlets reported on the company's financial struggles, and shareholders began pressuring the board to take more decisive action. Richard Calloway, who had initially viewed Clara as a minor inconvenience, now realized the full extent of her power. She wasn't just a dissatisfied customer. She was a force of nature, and she was dismantling his company piece by piece. Desperate to regain control, Richard reached out to Clara directly. He proposed a private meeting to discuss a resolution, offering to implement some of her reforms in exchange for an end to the boycott. Clara agreed to the meeting, but made it clear that she wasn't interested in half measures. "This isn't about making a deal, Mr. Calloway," she told him over the phone. "It's about creating lasting change. If you're not prepared to do that, there's no point in meeting." Richard hesitated but ultimately agreed. The meeting was set for the following week, and the outcome would determine the future of the airline and Clara's fight. Clara's resolve. As the meeting approached, Clara reflected on how far she had come. What had started as a single moment of humiliation had grown into a movement that was shaking an entire industry. She had faced resistance, ridicule, and threats, but none of it had broken her spirit. Clara knew the battle wasn't over, but she also knew she was on the verge of something extraordinary. The airline had underestimated her from the start, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. "I'm not just fighting for myself," she told Angela during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "I'm fighting for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong. And I'm not stopping until we win." As Clara prepared for the meeting, she felt a sense of calm determination. She had faced challenges her entire life, and this was no different. She wasn't just a passenger demanding respect. She was a leader inspiring change. And Clara Henderson wasn't about to back down. Victory and legacy. The day of Clara Henderson's meeting with CEO Richard Calloway had arrived. It was a pivotal moment, not just for her, but for the thousands of people who had rallied behind her cause. Clara understood the weight of the responsibility she carried. This meeting wasn't about revenge. It was about creating a legacy of dignity and respect that would outlast her. The meeting took place in a neutral setting, a private conference room in a high-rise overlooking the city skyline. Clara arrived early, her presence calm and composed, yet brimming with an unmistakable aura of determination. With her were Angela Torres and Gregory Dung, two of her most trusted allies. Together, they represented a movement that had grown too powerful to ignore. Richard Calloway arrived shortly after, flanked by two senior executives and the airline's legal counsel. His expression was guarded but professional. Clara noticed the faint lines of exhaustion etched into his face. The boycott had taken a toll, and it was clear that the airline could no longer afford to dismiss her. "The meeting begins." Richard began the meeting with a carefully crafted statement. "Mrs. Henderson, let me start by saying that we deeply regret the experience you endured and the circumstances that brought us here today. We recognize the need for change, and we're prepared to work with you to address the issues you've raised." Clara's gaze was steady as she replied, "I appreciate your acknowledgement, Mr. Calloway, but words are not enough. This isn't about one experience. It's about systemic failures that have persisted for far too long. If you're serious about change, then let's discuss concrete actions." Angela Torres spoke next, laying out the evidence they had gathered: testimonies from employees, customer complaints, and internal documents that revealed a culture of negligence and bias. Gregory added legal weight to their case, citing potential liabilities if the airline continued to ignore these issues. Richard listened intently, his expression betraying a mix of discomfort and grudging respect. When they finished, he leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "You've made your case, and I won't deny the gravity of the situation. But implementing the kind of sweeping reforms you're proposing will take time and resources. We need to find a path forward that balances progress with feasibility." Clara didn't flinch. "Progress without accountability is meaningless, Mr. Calloway. I'm not here to negotiate half measures. If you truly want to rebuild trust and restore your reputation, then you need to commit to real change. Anything less is a disservice to your employees, your customers, and your shareholders." The turning point. The discussion continued for hours, with both sides presenting their perspectives. Clara remained firm, countering every attempt to dilute her proposals with well-reasoned arguments and undeniable evidence. Angela provided emotional weight, sharing stories from employees who had risked their jobs to speak out. Gregory emphasized the potential financial benefits of a reformed, inclusive corporate culture, appealing to the board's bottom line. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that Clara held the upper hand. The airline was bleeding revenue due to the boycott, and the board was under immense pressure from shareholders. Richard, once skeptical of Clara's intentions, now saw her not as an adversary, but as a force of change that could salvage the airline's future. Finally, Richard exhaled deeply and spoke. "Mrs. Henderson, you've made it clear that anything less than meaningful reform is unacceptable. I'm prepared to recommend to the board that we adopt your proposals in full. But I need your assurance that you'll work with us to implement these changes." Clara nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Mr. Calloway, my goal has always been to create a better future for this airline and everyone it serves. If you are truly committed to this journey, then I'll stand with you." The agreement. The agreement they reached was unprecedented in the airline industry. The reforms included mandatory diversity and inclusion training. Every employee, from executives to ground staff, would undergo training designed to combat bias and foster respect. Customer Advocacy Program. A new department would handle customer complaints with a focus on transparency and accountability. Employee Equity Initiative. Policies were established to ensure fair treatment and equal opportunities for all employees, including anonymous reporting channels for grievances. Independent Oversight Committee. Composed of external experts and community leaders, this committee would monitor the airline's progress and ensure compliance with the new policies. The agreement also included a public apology from the airline, acknowledging past failures and committing to a new path forward. Clara would serve as a consultant during the transition, lending her expertise and ensuring that the reforms were implemented effectively. The aftermath. The announcement of the agreement sent shockwaves through the industry. News outlets hailed it as a landmark victory for corporate accountability, and social media erupted with praise for Clara's perseverance. The boycott ended, and ticket sales gradually began to recover as customers expressed their support for the airline's new direction. Clara, however, remained grounded. She knew that implementing the reforms would be a long and challenging process, and she was determined to see it through. She worked closely with the Oversight Committee, attending meetings, reviewing reports, and holding the airline accountable at every step. Angela Torres played a key role in the transition, using her first-hand experience to advocate for employees and ensure their voices were heard. Gregory Young continued to provide legal guidance, navigating the complexities of the agreement and protecting the movement's integrity. Clara's legacy. Months turned into years, and the airline underwent a remarkable transformation. Incidents of discrimination and mistreatment declined sharply, employee satisfaction improved, and customer loyalty soared. The airline became a model for the industry, proving that profitability and inclusivity could go hand in hand. Clara's journey inspired countless others to take a stand against injustice, sparking similar movements in other industries. She received numerous awards and accolades, but she remained humble, always emphasizing that the victory belonged to everyone who had fought alongside her. In her final public speech as a consultant for the airline, Clara addressed a crowd of employees, shareholders, and supporters. "This journey wasn't easy," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "But it was worth every step. Together, we've shown that change is possible, that respect is not a privilege but a right. This isn't the end. It's the beginning of a legacy that will endure for generations. Thank you for believing in this fight and in the power of resilience." The audience rose to their feet, applauding Clara as she stepped down from the podium. She had turned a moment of humiliation into a movement of empowerment, proving that one person's determination could change the course of an entire industry. As Clara left the stage, her heart swelled with pride. She had achieved more than she ever imagined, but the true victory lay in the lives she had touched and the future she had helped to shape. Clara Henderson's name would be remembered not just as a symbol of resistance, but as a beacon of hope and possibility.